I'm sure some of us still remember the days when most movies were just a self-contained story that maybe got one or two sequels and didn't tie into this complex web of spin-offs and prequels and sequels, or weren't just an elaborate advertisement for a limited series on the production company's proprietary streaming service. You know, the lame and boring way of years gone by. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally like an overly convoluted web of interconnected story elements to tie all of my entertainment together. A lot of stories are perfectly fine surviving on their own, but because of some new phenomenon that I can't really put my finger on, it seems like we have collectively conditioned ourselves to have this need for interconnected storytelling, making our squishy gray matter seek to create connections where there really doesn't need to be. And there's no more place that this is more apparent than fan theories. Now, there are a lot of fan theories floating around out there, and while some are simply made up for fun as a sort of what-if scenario, a lot of others look a little deeper into a story or a collection of stories, and there's actually been a few fan theories that actually end up aligning with what the original creators have in mind by piecing together subtle details that hint at something bigger going on. Now, there was one such fan theory that made its way around the internet for several years concerning the Disney movies Frozen, Tangled, Tarzan, and The Little Mermaid. The theory goes that around the time that Anna and Elsa's parents left for their voyage, the queen became pregnant and had a son, and during the trip, the ship was beset by a storm and sank to the bottom of the ocean, to later be discovered by Ariel. The king and queen and their newborn child survived, however, and landed on the shore of a jungle landscape and used the washed-up wreckage to build a treehouse. They were eventually killed by a leopard, but the baby survived the attack, was found by a gorilla named Nala, and raised as her own son, and you know the rest. Now, from the first time that I heard this theory, it never really made a whole lot of sense to me because the times and locations just didn't really line up in my mind. But all the same, a lot of other people really liked this theory and considered it fact in their headcanon. And for years it was never outright confirmed by Disney, but it wasn't blatantly denied either until the arrival of Frozen 2, which provided some very scathing story details that I'll get to later on. And that's where most people would have closed it down and moved on to something else, but where's the fun in that? Just because we know the four aren't concretely connected, it would still be fun and interesting to try to make at least a little sense of it, or find out how the stories relate. And the two most important things you have to look at here are time and place, but that's where things get interesting, because for the most part, Disney movies have deliberately been ahistorical. They choose to smash together different architectural periods, fashions, and technologies to keep a more fantastical and timeless feel. They've given a distinct setting to some of the movies over the years, but for the most part, it hasn't always been declared outright. So, how do we find some answers? Well, in my opinion, the best place to start is with the source material. Now, all of these stories are adapted from pre-existing tales, and while that doesn't concretely give us the information we need, it can help us determine a setting based on when or where they were written. And obviously places like Arendelle or Corona are fictional, but with a little digging and a dose of creativity, we can estimate when and where these stories take place. Now, being the oldest of the bunch, I'm going to start with The Little Mermaid, and I will specifically be looking at the original animated film and not the recent live-action adaptation, as the fan theory was around a lot longer before and therefore doesn't account for the live-action version. Now, for the few of you that aren't familiar with the story, The Little Mermaid follows the story of, you guessed it, a little mermaid named Ariel, who is fascinated with the surface world of humans but is forbidden from learning about it by her father, King Triton. When she encounters the human hunk Prince Eric, Ariel decides that she wants to join the world of the bipeds and trades her fishtail for feet by giving up her voice to the evil sea witch Ursula. Ariel manages to get Eric to fall in love with her, but Ursula hatches her master plan, deceiving everyone and taking over the sea. A big battle takes place, Ursula is defeated, King Triton agrees to let Ariel stay human and live with Eric, and everyone lives happily ever after. Now, the original tale was written by the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen in 1837. The people of Denmark are very proud of this story, and it's considered to be one of their most significant parts of the culture, and they even have a bronze statue in Copenhagen to commemorate the cultural significance of the tale. Now, both the Disney film and the original story are pretty vague on the setting, but we do know that the story obviously takes place in the sea and in an oceanside kingdom of some sort, so we can at least start there. I was able to find out that Eric's castle is loosely based on the Chateau de Chillon in Switzerland, so if we have to give a real-world location, we'll probably be looking somewhere in Europe, whether in Denmark itself or perhaps one of the countries of the Mediterranean coast. Again, because the film is pretty vague on its setting, we are having to take some liberties, and the same goes for the time period. And I did some sleuthing and found that apparently the Disney version of The Little Mermaid was written to be in a loosely connected timeline between Beauty and the Beast and Pocahontas. Now, because Belle appears in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, we can assume that Beauty and the Beast is set in or around 1482, since that's when Quasimodo's story takes place. And Pocahontas is obviously very easy to determine since it is based on historical events, meaning that it takes place in 1607, which is the year when the Jamestown colony was established. Now, taking that information and comparing it to the fashion and architecture of The Little Mermaid, it's probably safe to assume that it is set somewhere in the mid to late 1500s. Now right there, we're already running into some problems because The Little Mermaid seems to take place way too far in the past to directly play into the other three films. And while it's a neat idea that a shipwreck in Little Mermaid is the same as the King and Queen's ship from Frozen, it doesn't really look like it checks out. And furthermore, the amount of ship that is still remaining in the wreckage from Little Mermaid doesn't really make sense when you factor in that Tarzan's parents, whoever they were, would have had to use a large amount of the wreckage to build their treehouse. You can't have a relatively intact ship left over for the amount of building that they did. There's another much bigger issue regarding the time that the story takes place, but we'll get to that later. Let's move on to the next film in the lineup. Tangled is an adaptation of the classic Brothers Grimm fairy tale Rapunzel, which itself is loosely based on an even earlier French fable called Percinet, which was written in 1698, and it was also an adaptation of the various helpless maiden trapped in tower stories from various cultural folklores. The earliest publication of Rapunzel by the Brothers Grimm was in 1812. Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm were from Germany and had a very deep interest in preserving the folklore of their homeland, and this is a very big indication of the story's location. Now again, the Kingdom of Corona is not an exact equivalent to Germany, but the architecture, clothing, and names like Mother Gothel, Eugene Fitzherbert, and so on are very clearly evoking a Central European feel. And as far as timing, we actually do have a few clues in the movie, but the biggest comes from the musical number by all the ruffians in The Snuggly Duckling, and more specifically, this line from The Hook-Handed Thug.
Can't you see me on the stage performing Mozart?
The line obviously references the real-world person and famous classical composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Now, Mozart lived during the late 1700s and was considered a musical prodigy from a young age. His father actually took him and his siblings on a 3.5-year-long musical tour all around Europe where they performed for various monarchs, aristocrats, and other famous composers. They were basically the original Jackson 5. This tour started in 1762, and Mozart's fame and influence continued to grow until his death in 1791 at the age of 35. So tying that all back to Tangled, we can deduce a few things. Obviously, the story has to take place no earlier than 1762, but considering that Mozart is referenced by a grungy thug in a dive bar in the middle of the woods, Mozart would probably have to be pretty famous and widely known. And taking that into account, it is entirely possible that Mozart had already died by the time Tangled takes place, but that doesn't really provide us with any concrete evidence, so to find more definitive answers, we'll have to look elsewhere. And what better place to look than the frigid tour de force that is Frozen? Taking inspiration from a story by our favorite Danish author Hans Christian Andersen, Frozen tells the tale of Anna and Elsa, twin princesses of the Kingdom of Arendelle. The story of Frozen is actually vastly different from the Snow Queen, which is the Hans Christian Andersen story that the film is based on. It basically only takes the idea of a magical queen with ice powers that lives in a castle in the mountains and leaves just about everything Elsa out. Surprisingly, the first two books of the Chronicles of Narnia also take a lot of elements from the Snow Queen, but they lend themselves a little better to those stories in my opinion. The Snow Queen is actually the antagonist of the original story, and she's presented as an evil sorceress who kidnaps a young boy that's been corrupted by shards of a magical mirror left behind from a failed attempt by the devil to take over heaven. Yeah, the original story is bonkers. And it makes sense that Disney wouldn't include these elements in their whimsical children's story that's all just a big ploy to get people to stop Googling the whereabouts of Walt Disney's cryogenically frozen head hidden in the catacombs beneath Disney's castle. And I know you think I'm joking, but that is an actual real conspiracy theory about the movie Frozen. Walt Disney Corporation created things like Disney on Ice and Frozen to influence online search results to hide the fact that Walt Disney is hidden in suspended animation underneath Disneyland Park.
Open your mind!
Frozen is perhaps the easiest to place of all the stories we're looking at today, and there's a lot of elements throughout the two films and accompanying short films to give a pretty specific setting. In preparation for the film, the creators toured the Scandinavian countries of Northern Europe to get inspiration for the look and style of the film. Some of you may be surprised to learn that Arendelle is actually a real place in southern Norway, which actually checks out for the setting of Frozen. The real Arendelle is really just a small coastal town and has no castle, but it's still a good start. The real castle that Anna and Elsa's took inspiration from is the Akershus Fortress in Oslo, as well as the Hidalstave Cathedral. So obviously we're looking at a Nordic country, as the names, architecture, and inclusion of creatures like trolls are all indicators of that region's ancestral culture. And although Denmark is technically considered a Nordic country and is the native land of Hans Christian Andersen, there are a lot of indications that Frozen is more likely set in a fictional equivalent of Norway. The Kingdom of Arendelle is a place of high mountains and vast spreads of snowy forest, which matches up with the landscape of northern Scandinavia. And additionally, the location of Arendelle's capital was modeled after the Nærøyfjord region of Norway's longest fjord, which is Sognefjord. And Sven the reindeer is also a big clue, as he is a Eurasian mountain reindeer, which are native to the Finno-Scandian Peninsula, which is coincidentally the same part of the world that Norway is native to. Okay, maybe it's not a coincidence. Point is, Frozen is set in Norway. Now, since we see Flynn and Rapunzel on the bridge in Arendelle looking more or less the same as they did at the end of Tangled, we can assume that Frozen takes place shortly after, meaning it too takes place no earlier than the late 1700s. There are no dates specifically given in Frozen, but Oaken the shopkeeper does mention that it is July.
Oh, a real howler in July, yes?
So that's at least something. There are a few more clues to the setting of the films in Frozen 2, but I'm going to take a detour and look at Tarzan first, since that pertains more to the fan theory that started this whole quest for answers. So Disney's Tarzan is adapted from the first book in the series by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and it's a moderately accurate retelling of the book's events, obviously with a few things changed to make the story more palatable for kids, and also a little bit more of a self-contained story. There's actually over 40 different books making up the official Tarzan series, and over half of them were written by Burroughs himself. Tarzan is widely considered to be one of, if not the most important and influential characters in all of fiction, and his stories have been adapted more times and in more forms of media than any other book. Disney did make a few movies and TV series that continued the story of our favorite loincloth-wearing ape man, but those two largely deviate from the books. What does carry over from the books is the approximate time and place. Now, while the researchers for the film visited Uganda and Kenya to study gorillas, the book actually takes place in the western coast of Africa in what is now the countries of Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, and Equatorial Guinea. This region is also the habitat of the western lowland gorilla, scientifically known as, wait for it, gorilla, gorilla, gorilla. You can also find the African leopard in this part of Africa, but they have a much larger distribution than gorilla cubed, so the appearance of Sabor is not really a huge clue to the location. But all the same, it's pretty safe to assume that Disney's Tarzan also takes place in West Africa. And as far as the year, the book again gives a definite setting of the year 1888, and looking at the film, that also lines up. The clothing of the characters certainly matches with British fashion of the time, and the fact that they traveled to Africa in a steamship means it's at least 1820, as that is around when steamer ships rose to popular use. Another big indicator of the setting for Tarzan is actually Clayton's gun. Large-bore double-barrel rifles were common for safari hunters at the time, as they could fire massive rounds like a 600 Nitro or a 375 H&H Magnum, which were capable of dropping elephants and lions in one shot. However, looking at the shells that Tarzan finds when first encountering the humans indicates that Clayton is actually using a shotgun, which is further backed up when Clayton fires at Tarzan, shredding the bamboo and leaving multiple tiny holes in what is left. Clayton is therefore most likely using something like the British Holland and Holland paradox. Holland and Holland was considered to be one of the best manufacturers of safari guns at the time, and even today their guns can go for upwards of $30,000. They were known for being extremely reliable and rugged, so it would certainly make sense for a seasoned hunter like Clayton to use one, and the Paradox was among the best guns for the job. The Paradox actually had a very intuitive design for the time, as the barrels were smooth like a normal shotgun up until the end, where a small amount of rifling gave the shooter just a little bit of extra accuracy. It was a precursor to things that would eventually develop into modifiable chokes that you see in modern shotguns. Clayton is very clearly seen using brass shells, which weren't manufactured for shotguns until the late 1860s. Now, Clayton's shotgun is obviously seen with exposed hammers, unlike the real-world H&H Paradox, but I'm going to chalk that up to that just being a classic cartoon depiction of a shotgun more than anything else. Let's not take ourselves too seriously here. So taking all that information about Tarzan and his jungle escapades into consideration, we really have no reason to assume that the story takes place at a different time than the books, so Tarzan can be estimated to take place around the 1880s. So now that we've laid the groundwork for the 4 movies, let's revisit that fan theory and see how it lines up. The Little Mermaid is most likely set in Denmark or a similar Mediterranean country around the mid to late 1500s, placing it earliest in the timeline. The next film, Tangled, is set in Germany or some other Central European country around the late 1700s or early 1800s. And we know that Frozen has to take place roughly around the same time and is set in Norway. And finally, Tarzan, as just mentioned, takes place in West Africa during the late 1880s. If we compare this new timeline with that of the theory, it obviously doesn't look too good for the chain of events the theory is trying to suggest, but as I mentioned earlier, there's also some more Frozen lore that blows this whole thing out of the water, so let's explore that now. Obviously, Frozen 2 is a continuation of the story from the first film and really dives more into the magic and lore of Arendelle, telling us more about the origin of Elsa's powers and overall just builds on a lot of the elements from the first film. Now, that being said, we are actually given a few specific dates that tell us exactly when Anna and Elsa's adventures are taking place. During a scene from the short Frozen Fever, we are shown a map with Roman numerals in the upper left-hand corner, implying that the year in which King Agnar and Queen Iduna's ship sank was in or around 1840. Now, given that the first Frozen takes place roughly 3 years after the loss of the King and Queen, the events of the first Frozen film take place most likely in 1843, and more specifically in the month of July, as confirmed by the shopkeeper. Expanding on that, Olaf's Frozen adventure would take place in December 1843, as it's still the first year since the castle gates were opened, and Frozen Fever takes place almost a year later on Anna's 19th birthday, which would be in 1844. Therefore, Frozen 2 would be in November of 1846. Now, we learned from Lieutenant Matthias and Yelena in Frozen 2 that the mist surrounding the Enchanted Forest lasted for 34 years, 5 months, and 23 days, meaning that it most likely began in June of 1812. There are also a few little more bits of information that clue us in on the setting, such as the scene where young Agnar is reading The Little Mermaid, which of course debuted in 1837, and we also see them use a camera at the end of the film. The oldest surviving photographs are from around the 1820s, and cameras didn't really start seeing common use even for royalty until the late 19th century, and this is backed up by the characters' unfamiliarity with the camera in the film. But the biggest piece of the film that debunks the whole fan theory is the fact that Anna and Elsa actually find the lost ship of the King and Queen in the Enchanted Forest far to the north, meaning that there is no possible way that it sunk deep enough to be found by a mermaid or close enough to Africa for them to make it to the jungle and build a treehouse from the wreckage. You know, taking all that into consideration now, I have to wonder if Frozen 2 was partially written specifically to debunk that fan theory, because there's so much in the film that directly contradicts it. I realize that I'm a little bit late to the party to address this fan theory, but with the arrival of the Little Mermaid remake earlier this year, I was reminded of it again, and I figured it would have been a fun thing to explore. It is admittedly a pretty pointless thing to examine in such detail, but hey, that's what I'm here for, right? I do it so you don't have to. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate you being here to listen to me ramble about another pointless subject, and I'll see you next time when I do it all again.